The air inside Columbia University's political science auditorium was thick with anticipation. Students bustled into their seats, whispering about the day's lecture. The course, Modern Political Rhetoric, was already known for its fiery debates, thanks to its outspoken professor, Dr. Evelyn Carter. A self-proclaimed progressive and critic of conservative ideologies, Dr. Carter never shied away from controversy. Today, however, an unusual presence in the front row made the energy in the room even more charged. Barron Trump, son of the 45th and now sitting U.S. President, Donald Trump, sat calmly in the front row, dressed in a sharp navy blue blazer and white button-down. His presence was a quiet but undeniable statement. At 19, Barron had stepped into the public eye more than ever before, but today was different. He was just another college student attending a lecture. Dr. Carter, however, saw an opportunity. Clearing her throat, she stood at the podium, scanning the room before smirking slightly. This is going to be interesting, she thought. Welcome, everyone, she began. Today's topic is leadership and public perception in the age of media. We'll be analyzing how world leaders shape narratives, influence voters, and, she paused, her eyes locking onto Barron's, how some of them do so through lies, incompetence, and blatant manipulation. A few chuckles rippled through the hall. Barron didn't flinch. Dr. Carter continued. Take, for example, the current sitting U.S. President Donald Trump, a man who, let's be honest, has redefined political discourse, if we can even call his Twitter rants discourse at all. This time, laughter erupted. Some students nudged each other, waiting for Barron's reaction. He didn't budge. He simply folded his hands in his lap, listening. Encouraged by the response, Dr. Carter leaned forward on the podium. Trump has been called many things, a populist, a demagogue, a reality TV star who stumbled into the Oval Office. He's built his brand on divisiveness, misinformation, and a personality cult rather than actual policy. The question we must ask is, how does someone like this maintain support, even when his track record shows incompetence? The laughter grew louder. Some students turned toward Barron, but he remained composed. Dr. Carter wasn't done. She clicked on her remote, pulling up a slide of Trump's most controversial tweets. One read, "Fake news is the enemy of the people. Now, students, let's analyze this. This is a classic authoritarian tactic, discrediting the media, eroding public trust in journalism, and manipulating people into believing that only he speaks the truth." She turned to Barron directly. "I imagine this must be an awkward lecture for you." A hush fell over the room. The attack was direct. Students expected Barron to lash out, get defensive, or storm out. Instead, he smiled slightly. Then, Barron Trump spoke. "Not at all, Professor," he said, his voice even. "Please, continue." Something in his tone unsettled her. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was confidence. Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment but pressed on. "Let's look at how Trump treats his opposition. Insults, nicknames, personal attacks, Crazy Nancy, Sleepy Joe, Pocahontas. Real presidential behavior, right?" She smirked, looking for more laughs. Instead, Barron tilted his head. "Professor," he said, "if nicknames and insults disqualify someone from leadership, then why did you just do the same thing to my father?" The room fell dead silent. For a moment, you could hear a pin drop in the lecture hall. The same students who had been laughing moments earlier now exchanged wide-eyed glances. Dr. Carter, who prided herself on quick comebacks and sharp wit, faltered. She adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat, attempting to regain control. Well, she began, her usual composure slipping. "There's a difference between holding public officials accountable and engaging in juvenile name-calling, Mr. Trump." Barron leaned back slightly in his chair, his face calm but focused. "I agree," he said, "but shouldn't that apply to everyone? If a sitting president shouldn't reduce people to names, then shouldn't a professor of political science hold herself to the same standard?" A low murmur spread through the room. It wasn't defiance in his tone, it was clarity. Barron wasn't here to protect his father's ego. He was here to ask a question that hung heavy in the air. If we demand respect from our leaders, shouldn't we also practice it ourselves? Dr. Carter's jaw tightened. Criticism is part of a healthy democracy, she said, her voice clipped. It's not personal, Barron. It's about truth and accountability. I agree again, Barron replied smoothly. So, in the spirit of truth, may I ask, are you equally critical of the other presidents who've held this office? Or does my father get special treatment because he challenges ideas you personally dislike? A student in the back stifled a gasp. Another scribbled rapidly in a notebook, sensing the weight of the conversation. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. Barron wasn't angry, defensive, or dismissive. He was asking questions that no one expected. Dr. Carter smiled thinly, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her irritation. All right, she said. Since you're interested in balance, let's talk policy. Do you defend your father's decision to withdraw from global climate agreements? Or his stance on immigration? Let's hear your defense. Barron didn't hesitate. I don't agree with everything my father does, he said, surprising many in the room. But if we're talking about climate, isn't it also true that the United States has reduced carbon emissions more than several countries still in the agreement? Shouldn't that count for something? Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow. And immigration? How do you justify the border policies? Barron exhaled softly, choosing his words carefully. My question isn't about defending every policy. It's about why we only apply outrage selectively. If enforcing immigration laws is cruel now, was it also cruel when President Obama deported millions under similar policies? Or does the outrage only surface when my father is involved? A nervous ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Not mocking, but impressed. One student, a self-described progressive, leaned over to his friend. Dude, he whispered, he's kind of killing it. Dr. Carter's polished exterior began to crack. She had expected defensiveness, arrogance, anything but thoughtful precision. You're suggesting there's a double standard, she said finally. I'm suggesting that if truth matters, then we should tell the whole truth, Barron replied. And if you're asking for civility, it should apply to everyone, politicians and professors alike. The weight of his words settled over the lecture hall. For once, Dr. Carter had nothing to say. And for the first time in her career, a student had turned the lesson back on her. The silence in the lecture hall stretched on, heavy, charged, and impossible to ignore. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others stared at Barron Trump with newfound curiosity. The atmosphere, once playful and mocking, now felt like a courtroom where the professor herself was on trial. Dr. Carter, who had spent years challenging authority figures, found herself at an unfamiliar loss. She wasn't used to being questioned with such poise and precision, especially by a Trump. After a beat, she forced a smile and leaned against the podium. You raise an interesting point, she conceded, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. But let's not pretend your father is a victim here. He is the most powerful man in the world. Surely, he can handle a little criticism. Barron tilted his head slightly. Criticism isn't the problem, he said. Selective criticism is. If your goal is truth, shouldn't that truth apply no matter who's in office? Several students nodded subtly, something Dr. Carter couldn't miss. The tone of the room was shifting, and for the first time, she wasn't steering the conversation. Barron continued, his voice steady but thoughtful. I'm not here to defend every word my father has ever said. But let's be honest, civility is a two-way street. You talk about the power of words, and I agree. But when you mock someone, even the president, aren't you encouraging the same kind of rhetoric you claim to oppose? The words hung in the air like a challenge. A young woman near the back raised her hand hesitantly. I mean, he has a point, she said softly. Aren't we all kind of guilty of reducing people to labels? If we want better leadership, shouldn't we also be better? A ripple of murmurs followed, and for the first time, the power balance in the room tipped fully toward Barron. Dr. Carter folded her arms, her frustration barely concealed. So, your solution is what, coddle public figures? Avoid calling out injustice? No, Barron said simply. My solution is fairness. Criticize policy, sure. But let's not pretend mocking people we disagree with makes us better. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. What if we used our words to debate ideas instead of dehumanizing people? My father's not perfect, but no one is. So maybe instead of tearing each other down, we focus on actual solutions. The shift in the room was undeniable. Students who had laughed at the start now looked pensive, even unsettled. The professor, known for her sharp rhetoric, seemed to falter under the sheer weight of Barron's calm clarity. A young man in a hoodie raised his hand. Honestly, I've never thought about it that way. We all talk about being better. But he's right. If we want kindness, shouldn't we practice it too? Dr. Carter opened her mouth to respond but found no easy rebuttal. And just like that, the conversation she had tried to control had slipped through her fingers. The tension in the lecture hall didn't break. It deepened. What had begun as a playful jab at a controversial public figure had transformed into something much larger. A conversation about fairness, respect, and the responsibility of those who shape public discourse. Dr. Carter, still leaning against the podium, took a slow breath. For the first time in her career, she felt the weight of her own words reflected back at her. She had always viewed herself as a champion of truth, unafraid to confront power. Yet here, in front of her students, the son of the very man she criticized had revealed an uncomfortable truth, her own biases. I'll admit, she said, her voice softer now. You've given me something to think about, Mr. Trump. Barron smiled faintly but didn't gloat. That's all I wanted, Professor. I'm not asking anyone to agree with my father. I don't always agree with him. I'm just asking that if we're going to hold people to high standards, we hold everyone to those standards, including ourselves. A quiet ripple of approval spread through the room. More than a few students nodded, their earlier amusement replaced by reflection. In the third row, a student who had laughed the loudest at Dr. Carter's jokes now shifted in his seat. He raised his hand hesitantly. I guess what you're saying makes sense, he admitted. I've never liked Trump, but I also never thought about how easy it is to mock people instead of engaging with ideas. Dr. Carter, always quick with a retort, found herself without one. Instead, she tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. You're right, she said quietly. It's easy to mock, harder to understand. Barron leaned forward slightly. Exactly. My father's policies, like anyone's, should be questioned. But when we reduce people to names and insults, we lose the chance to understand why people support them in the first place. Isn't that what real education is about? Another wave of murmured agreement swept through the hall. The lesson had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. A student in a leather jacket raised her hand. You know, she said, I came into this lecture expecting you to be defensive or arrogant, but you're actually really thoughtful. Barron chuckled softly. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to learn, just like everyone else. The simplicity of his words hung heavy in the air. Dr. Carter finally straightened, folding her hands in front of her. For the first time, her tone softened, not as a professor defending her beliefs, but as a person genuinely reflecting. Maybe I've been too comfortable in my own perspective, she admitted. I preach about fairness, but I haven't always practiced it. A collective hush fell over the class. The dynamic had completely shifted. Barron nodded in quiet acknowledgement. We all have blind spots, Professor. The question is, what do we do when we see them? By the time the lecture ended, no one rushed to pack up their things. The usual chaos of zipping backpacks and hurried exits was replaced by thoughtful silence. What had begun as a mocking lecture on Trump's leadership had evolved into something no one had anticipated. A genuine, thought-provoking discussion about fairness, civility, and the power of words. As the students filed out, Barron remained seated, flipping through his notebook as though nothing unusual had happened. But everyone knew it had. Dr. Carter lingered by the podium, watching as her students whispered among themselves. When the room had mostly cleared, she stepped down and approached Barron. You know, she began quietly, I've had politicians' children in my classes before. Most of them would have stormed out, or worse, tried to use their status to shut me down. She paused. You surprised me. Barron closed his notebook and met her gaze. I'm not here as the president's son. I'm here as a student, he said simply. And I don't mind hard questions, as long as they're fair. Dr. Carter smiled faintly, the tension of their earlier exchange replaced by a new sense of mutual respect. You gave this class, and me, a lot to think about today, she admitted. I may not agree with your father, but you've earned my respect. Barron extended a hand. I appreciate that, Professor. She shook it firmly. You'll go far, Mr. Trump, whether people expect you to or not. As Barron left the hall, students still lingered in small clusters, buzzing with conversation. The usual political debates had shifted. For once, the topic wasn't who was right or wrong. It was about how we speak, how we listen, and whether we're willing to see beyond our own biases. By the time the story spread beyond the classroom, people on both sides of the political aisle found themselves asking questions they hadn't before. And at the heart of it all was one young man's quiet but powerful reminder. If we want to demand better from our leaders, we must first demand better from ourselves.